When my parents threatened to sue me unless I gave my house to my sister, my lawyer laughed and I realized I was finally free. Growing up, the pattern was clear. Serafina had the newest fashions, special tutors, and fantasy trips. I received lectures about hard work and independence. At 16, I was flipping burgers at a shabby country airy while she prepared for a summer trip to Europe. When I brought it up, my parents advised me to recognize priorities. Translation: Serafina's future was more important than mine. I wasn't bitter at first. I just figured that's how things worked. Parents invest in the child they believe will succeed while the other learns to fend for himself. So I did. I worked through college, lived in tight apartments with roommates who forgot to pay rent and avoided going out while my peers partied. Every paycheck I set something aside. I wasn't sure why I needed a safety net. All I knew was that no one would catch me if I fell. After graduation, I realized I had two options: work in a low-paying job or take a chance. So I used my savings to create a tiny auto repair shop. It wasn't glamorous, and the first year was grueling. Late nights, long hours, weekends spent elbow-deep in engine grease, but it paid off. By year 5, he was making enough money to seriously consider getting my own house. Of course, my parents were aware of this. I'd voiced my desire to ultimately own a home rather than rent a shoebox flat, and each time I did, they would grin, and the discussion would move. My mother would sigh deeply. Serafina has been struggling so much. Rent is so expensive these days. My father would add, she just needs a little help. It would mean so much if she had a stable place to live. They never said it outright, but the message was clear. I was supposed to be the one to fix her problems. Never mind that Serafina's difficulties were entirely her own. While I was working 16-hour shifts, she was living her best life. Vacations, designer handbags, and nights out at upscale restaurants. But strangely, she was the one who needed assistance. Then there was the money. Over the years, I'd been assisting my parents financially, covering home repairs, unforeseen bills, and even sneaking them additional cash when things became tough. I didn't mind at first, after all, they were my parents. But then I started noticing minor things like how my mother constantly had a new purse and my father suddenly got a nice new watch. At first I assumed they had merely been saving. Then I recognized where the money was going. Serafina. My parents weren't struggling. They were simply funneling my assistance directly into her lifestyle. Then I overheard an exchange that altered everything. I'd stopped by my folks' place to drop something off. I hadn't planned to stay long, but as I passed past the kitchen I heard my name. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I stopped in place and listened while pretending to check my phone. I'm sure he'll do the right thing. My mother said, he's responsible, he's been saving 4 years. My father agreed, it only makes sense. He can't expect her to struggle, he's her brother. Struggle, Serafina. The same Serafina who had never paid rent in her life and still relied on my parents to pay. Her credit card bill, something was not adding up, and then it struck me. They were discussing my money. I stood there, my heart hammering as the revelation hit. They had a plan. I would buy a house without being asked, not for myself, for Serafina. And the worst part, they expected I would simply go, along with it like it was apparent, as if it were my responsibility. I wanted to storm in and demand answers, but I knew what would happen. They'd claim I was being selfish. They'd talk about family, duty, and how fortunate I was to have succeeded, while Serafina struggled. I have heard it all before. I needed to think, so I left without saying anything. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my little studio apartment, which had a flickering kitchen light that I hadn't fixed. I reflected on every time I had been told to wait my turn, every sacrifice I had made, and every time I had swallowed my rage and smiled. And I thought about Serafina and how she would respond if she knew what they were planned. Would she feel embarrassed, grateful, or would she simply presume it was her right? I received an answer the next morning. Serafina contacted me out of nowhere, her voice full of enthusiasm. She went on and on about the new spot she had discovered. "It's perfect," she exclaimed. 3 bedrooms, a backyard. I can finally move out. I waited for her to say the most important part, that she had a plan to pay for it, but she didn't since she didn't require one. In her mind, this was already decided. My parents had plainly ensured that. She even had the guts to say she'd let me crash in the guest room if I ever needed a place to stay. That was it. I realized I wasn't playing along anymore. The very following day, I did precisely what they expected. I bought a house, but not the own they had in mind. I did not tell anyone. There is no spectacular announcement, no explanations. Is elected a place I adored, paid my deposit, and signed the papers. It wasn't big, but it was mine. The first thing in my life that I genuinely owned. I assumed I had time before my family found out, perhaps a few months or perhaps a year. But life has a strange way of hurrying things up. I was in the middle of putting together my new kitchen, peeling off the ludicrous Live Laugh love stickers left by the previous owner, when my phone started exploding up. Missed calls and messages from my mother, father, Serafina, and even extended relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Then I saw the text that made my stomach drop. Why did we hear from their altar that you bought a house? I didn't know how they found out. Perhaps the agent said anything to someone. Perhaps Serafina had been looking at the same listings. It did not matter. What mattered was that I had made a move, and the real struggle was about to begin. The moment the text appeared on my screen, I realized my calm housewarming period was officially ended. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing, calls and messages. Some angry, others concerned, all with the same undertone: betrayal. I disregarded them. If I picked up now, I'd be dragged into a conversation where they distorted everything to make me the bad guy. Instead, I went back to building up my home. The previous owner had left behind some ugly wallpaper in the living room, and that was going to be the most distressing thing I had to deal with today. Then the doorbell rang. I already knew who it was. I felt it in my bones. When I opened the door, my parents appeared less like loving parents and more like corporate officials, eager to talk about my breach of contract. My mother's face was a mix of disappointment and anguish, the kind of expression reserved for when I forgot to call home. My father had his arms crossed as if he were preparing to negotiate a hostile takeover. Before they could even enter, I braced myself. The following 20 minutes were just as I expected. Accusations, guilt-tripping, and the entire "we're family" speech. My mother went on about how Serafina was upset and didn't know where she would live now. My father made it obvious that they expected me to do the right thing. And my particular favorite, the reminder that after everything they had done for me, this was how I would repay them. They did everything for me. For example, as a teenager, I was forced to pay rent, like asking me to pay for my own school, while they pay for Serafina's luxury outfit, allowing me to work 2 jobs while she enjoyed weekend spa trips. If anything, I'd repay them tenfold. I could feel my patience wearing thin. But instead of snapping, I remained silent, nodded along, and let them talk. I'd learned a long time ago that arguing was ineffective. They were not here to listen. They were here to further their story. Then came the ultimatum. My mother, her voice full of artificial calm, informed me I had 2 options: give the house to Serafina, or be disconnected. I had to control myself from laughing. Cut off from what? Whose love and support? The same affection and support that was always contingent upon certain circumstances. The same family that had never given me anything without asking. Twice as much in exchange. I assured them that I would think about it. Not because I would, but because he wanted them out of my home. They left looking victorious, as if they had surrounded me and forced me to submit. I took a big breath, entered my kitchen, and retrieved a beer from their refrigerator. Sat down and stared at my phone. More missed calls. Serafina had finally texted, and I could anticipate what it said. Something about me ruining her life and how she had relied on me. I opened it, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Serafina sent a message, but it was not intended for me. She had unintentionally forwarded it to our family group chat rather than the person she was talking to. The communication had a detailed strategy for how she and my parents were going to break me, how they'd keep up the pressure until I gave in and handed over the house. There it was, as clear as day. Confirmation that none of this concerned fairness or family. It was a planned takedown, and I was just the fool who was meant to roll over. I snapped a screenshot, saved it, and then sat there for a minute. For the first time in years, I felt something different. There is no anger or sadness, only clarity. They had never considered me family. I was only a resource to be called upon as needed. So, I made a decision. I was not going to argue. I was not going to explain myself. I was only going to show them how finished I was. The following morning, I began making my move. The following morning, he awoke with a plan. If my family wanted a conflict, they'd get it, but only on my terms. I was not going to fight or explain myself. I was going to take charge of the situation and make it clear that I was done playing their games. First, I secured everything. I called my bank and confirmed that only I could make adjustments to my accounts. He changed my passwords, safeguarded my key documents, and even installed security cameras around my home just in case. Knowing my family, I wouldn't put it past them to do something desperate. Then I contacted a lawyer. I had no idea if my parents could get me in trouble legally, but I wasn't going to take any chances. After describing my position, the lawyer informed me that as long as everything was in my name and I hadn't signed anything for Serafina, I wouldn't have to worry. That was encouraging news, but I was still not taking any chances. Later that day, I received an SMS from Serafina. She was willing to discuss, but only if I agreed to make things right. I ignored it. A few hours later, another text arrived, this time from my mom. She was worried about me and suggested we have a family meal to address everything. Yes, right. I was not going to fall for that trap. Instead, I chose to reverse the script. If my family felt they could influence me with pressure, I was going to apply some of my own. First, I went to social media. I published a simple post. Nothing big, nothing explicitly addressing them. I just posted a picture of my new house with the message, "Finally home. Worked hard for this and it's all mine." The reaction was quick. Friends and extended family began thanking me, commenting on how well I earned it. And then the real fun started. Serafina did not respond, but I knew she saw it. A few hours later, I received another SMS. This time she wasn't as courteous. She yelled at me about how selfish I was and how I had embarrassed her by making my purchase public. Apparently, several of her acquaintances had queried why she wasn't buying a house if I could afford one. Her ego had taken a knock and she was unhappy about it. Then came the phone call. This time it was my father. No more a faking care. No more were family rhetoric. He was enraged, accusing me of embarrassing them and being ungrateful. I let him rant. When he eventually asked what I was going to do to rectify it, I responded simply, "Nothing." That's when the threats began. If I didn't do the proper thing, I might never be welcome in their home again. What's my response? Sounds like a win-win to me. For the first time in my life, I did not feel bad about standing my position. I didn't feel like I owed them anything, since the truth was that I didn't. I banned Serafina's number. I muted my parents' calls. Then I got takeaway from my favorite barbecue establishment, opened a cool drink, and sat on my new porch watching the sun set over my hard-earned property. For the first time in my life, I felt completely free. The silence did not last long. By the next morning, my mail was overflowing with new messages. Serafina had gone into full meltdown. My parents had begun damage control. Apparently, some extended. Family members saw my post and began asking inquiries. My parents didn't want anyone outside of their small circle to realize how bad things were. I could almost hear their conversations. My mother desperately attempting to spin the narrative so she wouldn't appear terrible, and my father moaning about family responsibility and how I had somehow betrayed them. And Serafina, well, she'd gone nuclear. Not only was she yelling on the family group chat, but she was also venting her frustrations on social media. I scanned through her most recent posts, long theatrical captions about how difficult her life was, how she had been deceived by those closest to her, and how she was fighting to find a place to live. I nearly choked on my coffee when I noticed she had created a GoFundMe campaign. That's correct. She had launched a crowdfunding effort called Help Serafina Get the Home She Deserves. The audacity was nearly astounding. The description was even better. She portrayed herself as the struggling sister whose cold-hearted brother had refused to assist her during her hour of need. She conveniently left out the part where she was expecting a free house and had done nothing to deserve it. What about the donations? Agrin sum of $20 likely from one of Hirquilly entitled buddies. I had to admit that I was rather disappointed. If you're going to commit to the hoax, make it convincing. Still, the situation was becoming ludicrous. I needed to stop this before it went any farther. I didn't want to turn this into an internet family war, but I also didn't want to let them tarnish my reputation. So I decided to drop one final bomb. I created a second article, but this time I added some receipts, actual screenshots of Serafina's text message to me, in which she openly acknowledged to scheming with my parents to coerce me into giving her my house. I didn't provide any commentary, just screenshots and the caption, clearing up some misunderstandings. The internet handled the rest. Within hours, others began calling her out. Friends who had previously blindly supported her have now gone silent. Some even turned against her, understanding they'd been duped. Serafina erased her GoFundMe page and locked her social media accounts. My parents, too, were struggling to cope with the heat. Apparently, some extended family members decided to reach out and question why they thought it was acceptable to demand a house from their son while coddling their daughter. By the end of the day, the family group chat was completely silent. No more guilt-tripping messages or passive-aggressive calls, just silence, and it was amazing. I sat back and watched the sun fall below the horizon, my phone empty of notifications. I had a refreshing drink in my hand, a playlist of my favorite music playing in the background, and for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the next shoe to drop. I wasn't concerned with what my family thought or if I had done the proper thing. I'd done the right thing for myself, and that was enough. The hush lasted for a full week. There are no calls, texts, or anything. I anticipated my parents to make one more desperate attempt, but for the first time they appeared to realize I wasn't moving. Perhaps the public disgrace had finally set in. Perhaps they were regrouping. In any case, I was not about to get comfy. Then, just as I was settled into my new life, another surprise arrived. Certified mail. A large envelope bearing my parents' return address, the kind that never contains good news. I sat at my kitchen table, coffee in one hand and a letter opener in the other, prepared for whatever drill was inside. This was a legal notice. My parents threatened to sue me. I had to read it twice to ensure that I wasn't having hallucinations. According to the petition, they claimed I misled them into believing I was purchasing the home for the family's benefit and that I had unjustly profited myself at their expense. That was absurd. I had never made a promise to anyone about handing away my house, but their desperation had reached unprecedented heights. What is the best part? They demanded financial restitution for the mental suffering I'd caused Serafina. That's right. She was so upset about not getting a free house that they assumed she deserved money. I followed what any sensible individual would do. I laughed. Then I called my lawyer. The conversation was short. My lawyer could barely contain his delight as he told me that this lawsuit had no chance of succeeding in court. At best, it was a fear technique. At worst, it was a last-ditch attempt to coerce me into giving in. Regardless, I wasn't concerned, but I wasn't going to let it slip. If they tried to escalate things, I would immediately escalate them back. I made a few more calls, one to my bank to double-check everything was locked down, and another to a locksmith to strengthen my home security. Then I did something I knew would send them over the edge. I responded with a certified letter, notifying my parents that any additional harassment would result in legal action. 2 days later, phone calls resumed. First my mother, then my father, and finally Serafina. I disregarded them all. Some left contrite voicemails while others continued to guilt-trip me. My mother's was the greatest. She went from tearful to enraged in a single message, demanding to know how I could abandon my own family for something as insignificant as a house. Small, Therany, almost knocked me over. Why would they go to court over something so small? Finally, on the third day, he answered when my father called. He cut through the chit-chat and got right to the point. They would drop everything if I simply decided to work something out with Serafina. I informed him that there was nothing to work out. That was the final straw. He exploded, ranting about how selfish I was, how I had deceived them, and how no son of his would ever treat his family in this manner. It was the same type of speech I'd heard 100 times before. However, this time I felt nothing. I let him speak. When he finally ran out of steam, I simply told him I had nothing else to say. I wished him well, expressed my hope that they would move on, and hung up, and that was all. The legal threats were dismissed. The guilt trip is gone. My parents finally seemed to realize that I was not giving up. Serafina went radio silent. Either she recognized she was not receiving anything from me, or she found another subject to cling on to. For the first time in my life, I felt liberated. No more manipulation, no more obligations, just me, my house, and a future that truly belonged to me. I'd won. The first several weeks of freedom were challenging. I'd spent so much time waiting for the next round of manipulation that it seemed strange to wake up without fear of receiving a passive-aggressive text or another family ambush. My house felt more like a home than a location I had to defend. For the first time, I was able to focus on myself. I established a consistent routine, getting up early, going to the gym, and making genuine meals rather than grabbing fast food on the run. I finally had the time and energy to enjoy the simple pleasures in life, like sitting on my veer with a cup of coffee and watching the world rise up. It was the kind of peace I never knew I needed. But of course, peace does not stay long. One afternoon, while working from home, I heard a knock on the door. Before I saw, my intuition knew who it was. Sure enough, Serafina. She stood on my porch, looking less like the sister I grew up with and more like a door-to-door salesperson on the final day of the quarter. The entitled assurance was vanished, leaving behind an appearance of desperation. Almost. I did not let her in. Instead, I stood outside, arms crossed, waiting for whatever script she had written. She began with small talk, awkward and strained, as if she were reciting from a poorly rehearsed screenplay. Then came the true reason she was here. She reflected on everything and realized she'd been a little unjust. She informed me that she was no longer looking for a house, but rather a somewhere to stay for a short time. I almost laughed. A little while, correct, and then what? I let her move in, and now I'm paying her expenses while she sits on my couch whining about how unfair life is. Not a chance. I kept my reaction simple. Her parents had gone above and beyond for her. Why not stick with them? That was when the full truth came out. She was no longer welcome there. Our parents' reputation seemed to have suffered as a result of what happened. Relatives who'd previously tolerated their behavior were less likely to support them. Even Serafina's pals had distanced themselves. It turns out that when you go viral for attempting to defraud your own brother, people don't want to interact with you. Serafina was seeking for more than just a place to crash. She wanted to get away from the catastrophe she had created. I did not take the bait. I informed her I was no longer interested in performing that role. No hard feelings, but I was not responsible for resolving the issues she caused. Her demeanor shifted as soon as I said those words. The phony humility vanished, replaced by the same old anger. She labeled me selfish and claimed that families should support each other. I simply shrugged. She walked out in a huff, making a dramatic exit that would have worked when we were kids, but all he felt was relief. A few days later, he went to the mall to pick up some items. While standing in line at a coffee establishment, I heard a familiar voice. Serafina was speaking loudly to someone at a nearby table. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but when your sister's voice sounds like a megaphone, it's difficult not to. She was whining loudly about how difficult life was today and how she needed to get this work, an actual job, like a normal person. She complained about how stressful it was and how she couldn't believe people did this every day. Meanwhile, the woman she was speaking with appeared to be on the verge of telling Serafina that the majority of the population has always done the same thing. I bit my lip to avoid laughing. It was too wonderful. Instead of saying anything, I grabbed my coffee and passed by her table. She did not even notice me. However, as he stepped outdoors, I couldn't help but smile. For the first time in my life, I wasn't dealing with Serafina's issues. Someone else heard her tirade about life's inequities. And you know what? That was all right with me. Later that evening, I received a text from my mother, a last-ditch attempt to guilt me into rethinking something about how family sticks together. And she couldn't believe how cold I'd gotten. I ignored it. They had spent years emphasizing that I wasn't truly a member of their family until I served a purpose for them. Now, I finally understand something crucial. I was not cold, I was just finished.